Hey everyone, tonight we start with the gloomy, perilous and less than glamorous world of medieval assassins. These eerie individuals who slipped down castle corridors and dimly lit streets to alter history with a blade and a whisper while being made to appear cool by Hollywood. To be honest, it was a terrible experience to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you, and before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually love what I do here. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights, and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. To be clear, nobody in the Middle Ages wanted to stab a lord in the throat for 12 silver coins and the privilege of spending 3 days hidden in a barrel. There was no vocational path to being an assassin. It resembled a final stop on the train of a life gone terribly wrong. The majority of medieval assassins were not enigmatic outlaws who received their training in temples atop mountains. They might have been disgraced soldiers, desperate peasants, former thieves with good aim, or someone so out of the public eye that they could kill a guy and still go unnoticed in the census. If you were wealthy, you hired an assassin rather than becoming one yourself. You were in management if you owned a title to land or even a goat, but you were also in management if you had recently fled debtor's prison, had a knack for finding solutions, and could enter a tavern covertly. Congratulations! Someone was going to mumble a name and slide a coin purse over the table, and it wasn't a fun one. The calm turnip farmer, Bob, wasn't asked to be taken out. Usually it was a corrupt baron, a bishop with an excessive amount of wealth, or someone with a moat and 12 bodyguards. The job was gruesome, and the compensation was alluring. But by the time someone gave it some thought, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and most definitely no dental plan. Not to mention that there are no benefits, no pension, no honours, and no evenings off. A shingle that stated quiet eliminations by appointment was not exactly something you could hang up. You only needed to keep quiet, move quickly, and never ever reveal your occupation to anyone, especially not over ale at the inn. Yes, I do sell carpets on the road. The stains disappear. I pass away. Indeed, no one aspired to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. You weren't the hero. They landed there because the world ate them up and vomited them out. You were carrying a rusty dagger and wearing a hood. The villain wasn't even you. Everyone was uneasy because of you, the footnote, and you most likely didn't survive to enjoy the coin. Let's dispel the first myth completely. Assassins in the Middle Ages did not practice by candlelight in some secret monastery, with sage teachers and uplifting flute music playing in the background. There was no teacher, no montage, and no motivational speech. You didn't die the first few times you attempted, so if you learned anything, it was that. The majority of assassins lacked professional training. They were frantic amateurs who could climb silently without sneezing, and had a fair sense of direction. Excellent if you had military experience. That demonstrated that you were at least somewhat proficient with a knife. It's quite easy to stab someone, but it takes talent or luck, usually simply luck, to get away with both kidneys intact afterward. There were no safety briefings, no guild orientation sessions, and no manuals. You weren't taught where nobility kept their bedroom exits or how to recognise a body double. Poison, you figured it out while suspended from a windowsill, wondering whether you simply sneaked back into the servants' quarters. It was trial and error, with a strong focus on making mistakes. It did work sometimes. Sometimes your victim simply became a little lightheaded and became more wary of his soup. You may have sipped the wrong cup at times. If you were lucky, I mean lottery lucky, you might have learned certain skills from mercenaries or thieves. Perhaps an elder assassin taught you how to walk without squeaking on cobblestones, or there was no medieval poison control hotline. However, mentoring wasn't common. Because assassins never retire, it was uncommon and brief. Weapons training is gone. Ignore it. You didn't have a broadsword with you. You had a knife that you had taken from a guard, along with whatever else would fit under your cloak, and perhaps a garrote if you were feeling very ostentatious, jingling outside. You weren't some mysterious martial arts expert then. You were a man with quiet footsteps, rough hands, and a really bad connection with alleyways. Training did not lead to success. It was a result of survival. You mastered the art of killing by doing it fast and carelessly, then disappearing before someone could draw your face and affix it to a church door. In summary, your schooling was harsh, pragmatic, and provided no graduation ceremonies, just bloodstains, bruises, and the nagging knowledge that you were mostly on your own. Let's discuss your first motivation for being an assassin. A frigid, hefty, jangly coin that is gloriously spendable. You went into this because of the promise, but the truth is that you were paid in falsehoods. One does not seek a long-term connection when they employ an assassin. A one-time service, little paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you, are what they desire. They provide you with a silver pouch. If they're feeling giving, they'll split the money half now and half when the job is finished. But here's the thing. After we make sure you didn't mess it up, ruin our reputation, leave a trail that points back to us, or live long enough to tell anyone about it, the code is for after the work is finished. You risk your life, slip through darkness, and possibly even kill a baron while he's sleeping. Not poetic, not lovely, and when you come back, sure, the client ran away, apologising profusely, or worse, they attempted to murder you. Even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough, and a knife to the gut is less expensive than a bonus. You receive a handful of money, a brief nod, and a reminder that you were never here. Not for the danger, not for the blood, and not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral remorse. Fun fact, some of the contracts were phony political snares. After being instructed to kill a dangerous person, you would discover that the target was a dummy with guards waiting. Congratulations! You entered a sting operation with your name already engraved on the gallows, and you were unable to file a complaint in court even if the agreement was genuine. I want to sue Lord Edmund for violation of assassin contract, Your Honour. The court where you were the exhibit would be the only one you would see. You've learnt to expect payment in advance and to have no faith in anyone, not even the oily little scribe who promised that this work will transform your life. It did it mostly by making it shorter. Living on unfulfilled promises and disappearing before they broke you were the hallmarks of being an assassin. You accepted the position, were misled about the salary, and are most likely going to die as a result. Put the sneaky video games and fantasy novels aside and let's talk gear. There were no smoke bombs, crossbows that folded neatly into your boot, charmed daggers, or retractable wrist blades. Your arsenal was made up of anything you could steal, sharpen, or conceal under a frayed cloak without making a noise. If you were lucky, that is, if you found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe, you probably had a good dagger, which should be sharp, not curved like a dragon's tooth, hopefully free of rust, and ideally not smell like the last person you stabbed with its poison. Indeed, it did exist, but it lacked the glitz of a steady drop into a tumbler of wine. Made from plants, minerals, even toad guts, the majority of medieval poisons were unpredictable. Some were instantaneous. For some, it took hours. Some made your target throw up for 2 days, and after they recovered they were more irate and wary of the occasionally helpful stew ropes. With one, you could tie something up, strangle someone, or climb, but you'd better know how to use it quickly since nothing detracts from the scene like wrestling someone while moaning, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" Bows work well. Yes, provided you possessed one, were proficient with a gun, and weren't attempting to sneak it into a palace by posing as a flower arranger. The majority of assassinations were intimate. It's time to improvise with slate roof tiles. Perhaps a rusty nail would be worth a try. There's no time for fancy marksmanship. It's just quick, silent, and hopefully not sloppy enough to slip in and you didn't get backups if your blade bent, broke, or fell down. With purpose, the shoe buckles. In times of need, you kept your tools close by, not for protection, hidden in your boots, or if necessary inside hollowed-out bread. Take action. All save the fact that your employer, closest buddy, and sole retirement plan were your weapons in this line of business. Upgrades and gear fiddling between missions were non-existent. You prayed that your kit wouldn't turn on you in the middle of a strike, but you didn't polish it, because ultimately it was not the weapon that killed. You were the only one ill-prepared and expected to work wonders with just a prayer and a spoon. They didn't hire assassins to shoot drunks in dark alleyways. You stabbed Jeff, the drowsy candle manufacturer, for no pay. Nobles, bishops, military officers, and occasionally even members of the royal family were among your significant targets. And it was so difficult to kill those folks. Initially, there were dozens of armed, well-fed and armoured guards. Some defended the rear, while others guarded the front. You would spend days learning patrol patterns, door creaks, and the precise number of stairs before the asthmatic night required a break. Some people would just stand there looking menacing, daring you to blink incorrectly. Secondly, there were walls. There were no front porches in castles. You still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil, and they had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats full of monsters that would bite if you didn't fall into the water. Yes, boiling oil, according to your job description. The cooks, scribes, stable boys, staff, and servants may get flambéed for ranking third. I'm just the herbalist, and if you gave them the wrong look, they would be whispering to the guard captain before you could say anything. Assassins used more than simply swords to combat. They were battling rumours. Furthermore, if it allows someone to maintain their dignity, medieval rumours spread like wildfire. Lastly, your real target is paranoid, with good reason. Backstaggers, relatives claiming their titles, and 36 people feigning sympathy were all around these individuals. They had a tester with them when they ate. Without 3 locks on the door, they couldn't sleep. Some even slept in rotating rooms, which were a lethal variation on musical chairs or in decoy beds. And if you hear that they're going to a feast, don't get too thrilled. Even though they will be inebriated, you will still need to overcome the royal guards, 3 hounds, a vigilant jester, and 50 witnesses carrying tankards. It could take weeks to even approach your goal. Either you would become the next public deterrent swinging from the castle gate with a sign that read, "Good try," or you would have one shot, one precise, perfect, non-squeaky, non-bloody ghost vanish in the night moment. You could do this by posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, or hiding in barrels. Let's be truthful. A medieval assassin is likely to conjure images of sleek black robes, leather braces, and perhaps an enigmatic hood that billows in the moonlight. In all honesty, you appeared to be a sick goat herder who had something to conceal. During the Middle Ages, disguises weren't particularly fashionable. You lacked retractable armour and specially made cloaks, peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the remnants of a guard outfit that undoubtedly still smelled like its former owner were all you had. Blending in was the aim, but doing so meant appearing like everyone else who hadn't had a shower in 2 weeks, was hobbling from previous injuries, and twitched nervously from starvation. Because of your cloak, you didn't appear suspicious. You forgot masks and kept shifting your belt to conceal a cheesecloth-wrapped dagger, which made you appear suspicious. There were no alternatives for man-fakes. The majority of facial covers only made you appear leprous, which was excellent for avoiding conversation but awful for going to parties. I'm Brother Tobias, so you had to think quickly if someone questioned who you were. Even if you got past the guards, I handle rooftop maintenance and silent prayer. There were no idiots in noble homes. Unfamiliar faces caught the attention of servants, particularly those who were unable to identify the cook's cat and fumbled with chamber pots. You were one all along. Congratulations if your disguise worked. I've never seen you this far from getting struck by a candlestick. Now, you had to spend hours acting like you didn't see all the wigs and really stab-worthy folks passing by. They were non-existent. You were stuck putting mud on your face, squinting, and hoping that no one would get close enough to notice that you were younger or older. Honey was used to stick the beard on. In actuality, you were not protected by your disguise. You were confused for about 5 minutes. After that, you had to be completely convincing or invisible, and if someone caught you in the act, well, let's just say that nobody wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room with a sword and nun's habit, especially on a feast day. As an assassin in the Middle Ages, you didn't have a squad. You didn't have a handler who sent you coded scrolls and encouraging words, a cunning alchemist in a hidden hideout, or a sidekick with a crossbow. You had serious trust issues and a rusty dagger. No guilds existed, or at least none that you could rely on. You were more likely to run into a ghost than another professional murderer looking to network if there were rumours of an assassin fraternity, which were mainly the result of mead and boredom-fueled pub gossip. What's causing the isolation? Because you survived longer in your business if fewer people knew you existed. Every touch was dangerous, every loose tongue a possible death sentence. It's possible that even your client is unaware of your true name, and if they were, you were already preparing to leave, making your friendship absurd. Friends inquired. Bloodstains, bruises, and the reason you always slept with a blade beneath your pillow were all noted by your lovers. You were unable to settle down. You couldn't afford to make a single mistake, have someone recognize you in a marketplace, and have your entire existence become a race to the closest sewage grate. Even other criminals avoided each other. Smugglers and thieves were friendly. You were the person who makes people vanish. They viewed you as a walking liability, or worse, they were afraid of you. Nobody wanted to share stew with someone whose line of work could draw a torches-wielding mob and expect sympathy. After quietly killing a dishonest bishop, you couldn't tell anyone how difficult it was to fall asleep. People assumed you were lying or dangerous if you mentioned your employment, and they were right. At inns, you therefore kept your weapons, scars, and secrets to oneself. Your eyes were always on the door as you sat in the darkest corner facing the wall. You never had too much to drink. You only ever spent one night there. Unless someone paid you first, and even then it was most likely not your true name, you didn't say it. As a medieval assassin, you had to learn how to disappear, not only from a crowd, but from every existence you were deprived of. Let's say you accepted the job, made a strategy, bought off the proper doorman, and pretended to be a very convincing chimney sweeper before you froze. Perhaps the target suddenly turned around. They might have been with their kid. Perhaps your knife hand trembled like a scared squirrel when you got the shakes at the worst possible time. You know what? A medieval assassin's failure was not a slap on the wrist or a poor performance review. Rather, it was a public, agonizing and highly theatrical death that frequently involved ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron instruments called Bonecracker's joy. As a result, you're now dead. The entire operation would be blown if the kill was missed. After surviving, your target informed everyone that they had been the victim of a murder attempt. The guards you once slipped past are now motivated since you were suddenly a wanted man with a thorough description, and most likely a crude sketch pinned to every bar wall within 30 miles. There were times when you had to worry about something other than your goal. Your client was the one. You were no longer useful if you failed. You were a liability who may be subjected to torture, questioning, or worse, verbal abuse. There were no second chances, no apologies. The blade slipped, and the very people who paid you would be the first to offer you a second contract. Tomorrow, I'll give it another go. You only had one chance, one moment, and if you blew it, your only hope would be to pass away soon, before anyone discovered who had hired you. In addition to failing to murder you, failure to be invisible and failure to be perfect, for assassins, perfection meant survival. Failure also meant shame, the quiet, degrading sort. Less than that. You might as well practice your last words and paint a target on your back. Because in this line of work, you're only as good as your last kill, and if your last kill wasn't successful, it didn't matter how many tasks you had completed in the past. Well, you'd better get moving. You succeeded then. The strategy was successful. True hit the dagger. There were no guards or screams, just a smooth plummet to the ground and a very significant somebody who was no longer there. Well done. Being a successful assassin in the Middle Ages did not entail drinking wine on a terrace as the city burned behind you, so now run for your life. It meant running through back alleys with a dog already sniffing your trail and someone's blood on your boots. There was no post-work drink with co-workers, no victory lap and no informal client debrief. Your new duty became evading everyone who now wants to kill you in ever more inventive ways, with guards arriving, doors closed, horses tied up on the opposite side of town and you most likely bleeding. You didn't even have time to appreciate your work before your blade hit. The city would go into lockdown in a matter of minutes, so you had to arrange your escape before the murder routes, disguises, fallback, safe places, and possibly a boatman who owed you a favour, or at least didn't ask questions. Lockdown meant armed checkpoints, closed gates, and a dozen angry men brandishing swords who had just received your preliminary sketch. The phrase "may be armed and extremely stabby" was also used. And let's not forget about the customer, presuming they truly intended to pay you. Nobody wanted a controversy. They weren't going to greet you with a thank you note and a smile at a quaint bar. Since an assassin who has just finished a mission is the most deadly person living, they would most likely disappear as well. You were too knowledgeable. You had shown that you could enter locations that others couldn't. Therefore, even after you succeeded, you left with a huge target on your back and a coin in one hand. What did you win too? Success did not equate to survival. Therefore, you had to spend a week sleeping in haylofts, paying ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark and posing as Brother Lucian in order to mix in with monks travelling east. The game would have to be restarted in a different city with a different name, and there would be even more players searching for you. You did indeed make the kill. Because assassins weren't only feared in the Middle Ages, you had to deal with the incredibly inventive paranoia of others around you, in addition to the misery of being a penniless chaste assassin and sleeping in goat-smelling places. The typical peasant believed that they were cursed. You were more than just a hooded killer. Under a full moon, you were some wicked creature that smeared frog guts on your blade and talked to devils. If not, how else could you elude guards and disappear in the shadows? Back then, superstition was rampant, but logic wasn't exactly common. Some people thought assassins could change their shape. Others asserted that unless you were cleansed with holy water, you were invisible. According to a well-known legend, assassins could breathe death through walls and struck agreements with woodland spirits. Imagine hearing a woman murmur, "Don't make eye contact," while strolling through a village. Even your tools were questionable, and he might hex the baby. It was obviously made in a cursed forge using poison that wasn't chemistry. That was witchcraft, and you most likely stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You were carrying a dagger. You would assume that this fear would be beneficial. People avoided you after all. However, the truth was worse. Superstitious mobs don't think twice or inquire. Before he calls lightning, they hurl stones, start fires, and yell things like, "Burn him." People overreacted because of your reputation the moment someone passed away, whether from a disease, accident, or choking on a chicken bone. It might have been a shadow man whispering he might have done it. Just simply being in the same village as a questionable death, you might be chased down. You had to keep moving because of that. In a world where people thought monsters had human faces, all it took to shout sorcerer and light a torch was a priest ringing a bell, and 5 irate farmers brandishing pitchforks as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Heaven forbid you if you were caught in possession of anything even slightly strange, like dried herbs, odd coins, or even a foreign accent. A threat was defined as someone who was too fast, too quiet, or too cunning. According to medieval reasoning, threats had to perish quickly, ideally by burning, poisoning, or a silent slaughter that left no mess, no screams, or steel on bone, just a swallow of the blood, done with a sigh. The theory is that, in actuality, poisoning someone during the Middle Ages was akin to using herbal tea and a negative attitude to win a bar brawl. Poisons were unreliable, to start. Neither pure cyanide nor a convenient tiny pill called fast-acting doom were available to you. You had minerals, plants, mushrooms, and perhaps a few toads. Even after gathering, grinding and praying, the target can develop a stomachache and become even more dedicated to his anti-assassin guard team. No scientific measurement was made. You did not do it exactly. The noble simply throws up and cancels dinner because you eyeballed it a bit too little, and you pass out from exposure before the first course is delivered. Kitchens in the Middle Ages were also chaotic. You couldn't just go in and use nightshade to season the soup. You had to sneak in while no one was looking, bribe or pose as a cook, or, worst of all, attempt to contaminate a dish that would be consumed by a dog and 3 tasters. Indeed, a dog and a noble person didn't merely consume food, they handled it as though it were a military operation. From the steward to the jester, everyone tasted, blessed, and sniffed their food. By the time it reached their plate, it had passed through more security than a royal wedding. Even if you snuck the poison in, it went undetected, and the target ate it. What came next was completely unpredictable. Hours were needed for some toxins. For some, it took days. Your target is laughing at a joke one minute. The next, he's demanding to see his astrologer while gripping his stomach. And guess who they would blame? Not the taster or the cook, if they lived. With your twitching eyes and herbal expertise, you are the quiet man. Therefore, poisoning wasn't effective, it was dangerous, slow, and full of variables that weren't in your favour. If you were caught, you weren't given a speedy death. Instead, you were questioned with tools until you admitted to poisoning everyone, even the dog and the duke. You would think that someone would remember your name if you were able to alter history by overthrowing a despot, destroying a royal line, or putting an end to a political menace. You were, in fact, an assassin. That implied that people were never supposed to remember your name. You might have pulled off the most iconic hit of the century and still ended up as a strange death in the official record. But at best you were a rumour, a hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the silent man who never drank his ale. Actually, that was the purpose. A tale wasn't what your client wanted. According to their need for plausible deniability, they were safer and less likely to be poisoned by their own assassin if fewer people knew who did it. You didn't sign your work, you didn't boast, you didn't keep trophies, you didn't exist outside of the kill moment, and if someone did know your identity, that was a loose end. Your name was buried the moment the job was finished, assuming you even used a genuine one. Additionally, loose ends had a very short shelf life in your line of work. And disregard honour. For the man who paused to fight with a single dagger in the middle of the night, there were no stone monuments or awards for stillness. A noble would commission a statue for themselves if they desired one. You received a wooden box, an unmarked burial, or, in the worst-case scenario, a head on a spike with the label Traitors. There were times when people only knew your name to curse it. Don't cross the monarch, you would become a whispered warning. Indeed, recall what happened to Lord Ulrich and how the perpetrator vanished like a spectre. Not notoriety, not fear, but simply not being there was your legacy. You were not meant to make a mark. You were meant to disappear. And staying around long enough to gain notoriety was a deadly mistake because, in the medieval world, assassins were forgotten, but heroes were remembered. You made it through and completed the task. It's a miracle that you were ever able to be paid. All you need to do now is remain silent, keep your head down, and have faith that your client will keep their end of the bargain and safeguard your identity, right or wrong. Because there was one rule in the realm of medieval assassination that was even more important than avoiding detection. Always be wary of anyone, especially those who are paying you. Your client did not employ you out of respect, whether they were a bishop with very loose morals, a merchant with ambition, or a noble. Since you were the sharpest tool in the shadows and they needed something terrible done, they hired you. You became a liability once the task was finished. You were too knowledgeable. You were aware of who desired the death, when, why, and perhaps even the price they were prepared to pay. Because of that, you were dangerous to them as well as to their adversaries. What then did they do? In order to tidy up and end the contract with something sharper than pen, they either sent someone else after you or they ghosted you and denied ever meeting you. Clients have even double-booked, paying one assassin to complete the task and another to kill the first one right away. There have been no refunds, only a decreased risk, and since powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't bargain with assassins, it was daring and your last error to try to blackmail a client by threatening to reveal them. They were crushed. A rare species would be honoured if your client had some. The secret that couldn't speak, the shadow that couldn't stay. Even success wasn't enough to gain their trust because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. Sure, you might get paid and be left alone, but even then you'd still have to assume they were watching you from a distance, with someone already sharpening steel and learning your walk. And nobody wanted to be the next one, not even the one who hired you. Suppose you managed to overcome the odds. You outlived your opponents, your bosses, the murders, the falsehoods, the poisonings, the betrayals, and most likely your own moral compass. Not at all, considering that assassins in the Middle Ages had no retirement benefits, no silent homes by the sea, no goodbye feasts, no pensions delivered in gold coins, and no murmurs of gratitude. You didn't settle into a quiet existence. Most of the time you either died or disappeared. The issue was straightforward. Even if you left your profession, you would never be secure because you had too many names in your memory, too many secrets in your thoughts, and too much blood on your hands. Nobody wanted you to retire. Even if no one followed you, they wanted you forgotten, which typically meant buried. And it's a big deal if you had to live in constant terror that someone could discover that a young, ambitious assassin recently got a contract for a dangerous, shadowy individual. Thus you once more altered your name. You relocated to a village where nobody questioned you. You claimed to be a guard, sold herbs, and faked a limp. Yet you still had trouble sleeping. You stayed away from crowds. You sat with your back to the entrance. You couldn't trust yourself, and your dagger still smelt like the man you got it from, so you hid it beneath the floorboard next to the sack of cash you never touched. There was something in your head from years of silent murders and fast escapes. You cringed at every knock on the door. You might be recognised by every stranger you meet on the way. Dreams were harmful, so you stopped having them. You couldn't laugh too much. You couldn't relax, and you couldn't love. You lived as though you were a ghost masquerading as a man. In actuality, a medieval assassin had no end in sight, just a steady, icy decline into obscurity, constantly on the move and constantly observed, until one day you vanished into thin air and nobody saw you. And that might have been your best bet. You've most likely figured it out by now. Being a medieval assassin wasn't noble, it wasn't darkly romantic, and it wasn't even very lucrative. Clothed in blood-stained linen, it was a short-lived, gloomy and unappreciated vocation that was pursued by a mob of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last even a day, let alone a week, since you would begin with the false impression that you would be slick, in control, and a whisper in the dark, but in reality you would be hungry, freezing, and just one wrong guess away from the noose. You would enter the town with your cloak tight, prepared to strike, only to find that your target had relocated. The stable boy you bought for information just sold you out for a mug of ale and a piece of bread that you would freeze at the wrong time, stab the wrong guy, get recognised by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel, and all of a sudden you're not a shadow. The guards are inebriated but trigger happy. The issue is you. Then you run. However, you're not accustomed to the mud, uneven cobblestones, medieval terrain, or the ridiculously high number of loose chickens in the street. A guard named Thomas, who was just fired and is seeking a way to vent, tackles you after you slip and fall, and even if you make it through that, you will still have to deal with the fallout. You will have no allies, no honour, and no future, just suspicion, and the growing knowledge that, even if you are successful, your only hope is to die old and alone, behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. You wouldn't last then. The assassin's life wasn't cool, therefore, to be honest, you shouldn't try. It was a ruthless device that ate humans and spit out only darkness. It provided power without meaning, without tranquility, and without a place in the world. The only thing that awaited you at the end was stillness, the silence that no one would question, because no one ever remembered you were there in the first place, before she was the feared queen of Macedonia. You did not create history, instead, you erased yourself from it. Whether or not she was descended from Achilles, Olympias, also known as Myrtle, was a Molossian princess from the rough tribal lands of Epirus. Whether or not she was a true hero, one thing was for sure. She was not a woman destined to live on the periphery of history. Rather, she was steeped in mystery and ritual. In addition to politics, prophecy, ecstatic rituals, and a respect for the ancient gods, all influenced her upbringing. She wasn't the kind of princess who embroidered tapestries and grinned. Her relationship with the gods was not performative. She was attracted to snakes, omens, and the wild rituals of the worship of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and invoked the divine in trance. It was intimate. She was not a mere worshipper. According to ancient traditions, which were probably authored by males, she personified both fear and fascination. She kept sacred snakes in her rooms and even let them curl up next to her in bed. We'll never know if this was true or just the kind of slander that comes with being a prominent woman, but it stuck to her supporters. To her adversaries, it made her divine. She was dangerous because of it. She wasn't just a princess. Her true power started in the eerie flicker of torchlight amid the murmurs of priestesses and the curled bodies of serpents, not in a battlefield or throne room. A living oracle, she was a lady influenced by something colder than steel and older than politics. Thus, violent, intelligent, and notoriously lustful Philip, the second of Macedon, came to the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation. He met more than simply a stunning princess. He encountered an enigma he couldn't avoid. Their union was more than a political partnership. It was replete of omens from the start and was a collision of power and prophecy. Some claimed that on the night of their wedding, lightning struck the sky. According to others, Olympias had a dream in which a thunderbolt entered her womb. It would all become folklore. However, there is no doubt that the union of Olympias and Philip II was not the ideal marriage for a queen who would eventually give birth to an empire. Rather, it produced Alexander the Great, and she intended to influence his fate from the moment he was born. It was a volatile mixture of paranoia, pride, and prophecy from the start. Around 357 BCE, Philip, who was ruthless, charming, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias. Olympias was probably only a teenager, but she wasn't a fool. She recognised in Philip a man who shared her ambitions and who might perhaps be a divine fit for her spiritual path. It wasn't exactly simple to enter the kingdom of Macedon. It was a land of ambition and iron, where brothers became competitors overnight and relatives assassinated monarchs. However, Olympias, Epirus's priestess, entered with her head raised and her gaze already fixed on the crown. Despite his political brilliance, Philip was not suited for monogamy. Therefore their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He would later marry other women, always for power and frequently for alliances. Olympias, however, was not one to remain silent in the background. She kept her own relationships, ran her own court, and was reputed to use rites and oracles to predict her own, and maybe Philip's fate. Even the birth of Alexander was surrounded with heavenly drama. According to legend, Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt had struck her womb, and that her unborn child was surrounded by dancing flames without being burned. According to reports, Philip envisioned using a lion to seal his wife's womb. Indeed, a real lion. They acted as though Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom but the entire world, regardless of whether they believed or made up these visions. However, even as the kid was praised, the royal marriage became more strained. Olympias harboured animosity toward Philip's previous spouses, particularly his later life marriage to Cleopatra, Eurydice, a Macedonian. This was not only a home problem, it was dangerous. Since Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, any son she had would be seen as more pure by the local aristocracy, which would directly jeopardize Alexander's future. She would use every serpent, dream ritual, and whisper she possessed to ensure her son wasn't just remembered but crowned. Olympias could see that the palace was more than just a house. It was a battlefield. She was no longer Myrtle. Now that she was Olympias, no one would succeed her son without incurring her wrath. The Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a battlefield of covert taunts, scheming, and acrimonious rivalries by the time Alexander was a teenager. Olympias fought for more than simply power. She was struggling to stay alive. Although she was aware that there were many snakes in the court, she was the one who taught them how to bite people, and as a result Philip II had started to turn away from her. He was drinking more, campaigning more, and perhaps most importantly, he was paying more attention to his advisors from Macedonia. His marriage to Eurydice, a young noblewoman who was not to be mistaken with the Cleopatra of Egypt, was the last straw. Attalus, the uncle of this Macedonian-born Cleopatra, was one of Philip's most important generals to Olympias. It was a declaration of war, not merely treachery. The wedding ceremony went horribly wrong. During the feast, Attalus made fun of Olympias and Alexander while intoxicated, questioning the validity of Alexander's birth. Was he a god's offspring, or was he actually Philip's son? Olympias likes to say that. Despite the fact that it was intended as an insult, Olympia took control of the tale and allowed them to mutter that Zeus had touched her son. He became untouchable as a result. Alexander fled Macedon completely and fled to Epirus after storming out of the feast. Her banishment, however, was not a defeat. In her native country, it was a tactic. She could rally support, whisper in ears, and observe as Philip's palace started to decay from the inside out since she was still princess. She was harmful, even if she wasn't physically there. The shockwave followed. Just as he was ready to invade Persia and crown himself not only king of Macedon but also a possible emperor of the known world, Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding. The question that reverberated through every marble hallway and torchlit hall was the same. Who did it? Was the act committed by the betrayed bodyguard Pausanias? Was court intrigue the cause? Did Alexander do it himself? Or whisper it quietly? Did Olympias do it? Nobody was able to demonstrate it. Nobody ventured. However, a lot of people thought it was true. After all, Cleopatra, Eurydice, and her infant child were all dead within a few days. Some claim they were murdered. Now that the serpent had made his way back to the palace, Olympias herself, nothing stood between her son and the kingdom. While others tried to make sense of the turmoil, Olympias took action after Philip died, and Macedon was either in mourning or confused. She moved quickly, viciously, and decisively. The young Macedonian queen and rival wife Cleopatra, Eurydice, was first removed, based on terrifying stories. She wasn't merely killed by Olympias, she humiliated the public by making her death symbolic. Some claim that after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter, Cleopatra was compelled to hang herself. According to some, Olympias had the infant incinerated on a funeral pyre. Everyone agrees that there was no mercy. In a royal palace, Olympias recognised what many moms in ancient courts would not allow. After Olympias finished playing defence with Cleopatra and her bloodline was gone, she could focus on securing Alexander's reign because mercy is a liability to a competing child, regardless of how little the future conflict may be. With little resistance, her adolescent son, who had already received Aristotelian training, was crowned king. Don't be duped, though. It was made possible by more than just his charisma or his father's legacy. She knew which generals to intimidate, which nobles to court, and which adversaries to subtly eliminate since it was Olympias. She wasn't merely defending her son's career, she was planning it. Even Alexander himself wasn't always in agreement. Despite his alleged disapproval of the violence against Cleopatra's family, he did nothing to stop it since he secretly knew what Olympias had always known. Bloodlines were both a boon and a bane in Macedonia, where power demands blood. Her son, now King Olympias, started to fade away from public life, but this was no retirement. She only moved from open blows to influence that was whispered. She stayed behind as Alexander got ready to begin his conquest of Persia, not as a submissive queen mother, but as the spiritual protector of his fate. She gave him holy artifacts, spoke to oracles, and carried out ceremonies on his behalf, to Olympias. Her son had a heavenly mission in addition to a military one. Alexander had no intention of going to war. No opponent, whether Macedonian, Persian or otherwise, could thwart that divine design as long as she was breathing. He was carrying out prophecy. She had cleaned the palace and crowned her son. Now, as Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, she would stand watch over his dominion from behind the curtain, her teeth bared. Olympias, a queen without a throne but not without authority, stayed behind in Macedonia. She was formerly known as Queen Mother. She did, however, govern in all but name. However, Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, was officially given regency. Olympias resisted becoming marginalised. She frequently warned, counselled, and occasionally reprimanded her son in her letters. These weren't devoted mother's charming letters. They were venomous and oracle-laced political briefings, and every syllable was read by Alexander, who was thousands of miles away. She reminded him of his real adversaries. She questioned his companion's loyalty. She chastised him for his interest in Persian traditions, his selection of wives, and his attempt to claim divinity. When Olympias was a mother or a priestess of divine will in Macedon, Antipater became more and more furious because no one else dared to utter these things to him. At every stage, Olympias undermined him. She incited opposition against him by using her position, her religious authority, and her familial connections. She could spread tales like wildfire, and with Olympias, a whisper might be more deadly than a sword. She was powerful in Epirus, Thessaly, and among the nobility. Her messages to Alexander grew increasingly urgent in the meanwhile. Whether she genuinely believed it, or was just afraid of losing control, she warned him of Antipater's ambition by portraying him as a second Philip, who was prepared to betray and usurp. The gap between mother and general grew as she persisted in pressuring her son to act Alexander, even if he was hesitant, because he needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he was fighting in Asia. Olympias observed, and she waited. However, she was becoming frustrated beneath her parental care and holy garments. She hadn't fought in a palace for years to be subject to an elderly soldier. Olympia witnessed the emergence of fissures as Alexander's empire extended from the Aegean to India. He was straying from the mother and the gods who created him, taking on too much and putting too much faith in outside counsel. She thought that she and divine favour were the reasons behind his conquests, and if he forgot that, Olympias knew how to remind monarchs of their true identities, even if that king was her own son. In 323 BCE, Macedon did not receive the news of Alexander's death in Babylon with great fanfare. Like a dagger it came. It was more than the death of a son for Olympias. It was the end of the universe she had spent decades creating for her son. The heavenly storm she had foreseen sparked and let loose had vanished, and he had left behind anarchy rather than a certain heir or successor. His powerful dominion was already beginning to fall apart. His alleged successors, the generals, were already splitting it up like jackals around a dead body. Antipater, who had little affection for Olympias, continued to rule both Macedonia and Greece. Even worse, opposing generals were vying for the marriage of her daughter, Alexander's sister Cleopatra, each attempting to use her ancestry as a claim to the throne. Olympia anticipated the outcome. There was no chance of a civil war. She would have to do something again, and it was inescapable. However, Alexander was no longer with her. Instead, she possessed his lineage, his infant son, Alexander, and the 4 children born to Bactrian princess Roxana. Roxana, whom Alexander had married, was still in Macedon and in danger. Even more so was the boy. Olympias understood that the baby was now the final authentic remnant of her son's history, which made him both a target and a weapon. Using the child's birthright to establish her own claim in the political arena, she sided with Roxana and the boy, desperate to keep them safe. However, things were changing. The generals who used to bow down to Alexander were not interested in bowing down to his mother or widow. Now they had aspirations, resentments, and armies. Olympias remained unflinching. She plotted because she had experienced snakes, traitors, and kings, and she wasn't afraid of a few warlords wearing crowns or stolen spears. She waited. She saw Antipater pass away and be replaced by his son Cassander, who had little patience for the old queen's antics and had ice in his veins. Soon, the two forces, Alexander's serpent mother and the icy usurper who desired her burial, would clash. Alexander was no longer there, but his shadow continued to move, and Olympias remained curled up inside it, poised to attack. Years after Alexander's passing, civil conflict erupted throughout his realm. Despite Olympias' boldest effort, she returned to Macedon as a political force of heavenly wrath, rather than a distraught mother. They had fractured the regency. Roxana and little Alexander IV were essentially imprisoned as Cassander, the son of her old nemesis Antipater, was assuming power. The writing on the wall was visible to Olympia. Her grandson would disappear like a shadow at sunset if she did not take action right away. She therefore struck a bargain with Polyperchon, an elderly general who still had a glimmer of genuine power. With the support of the Polyperchons, Olympias led an army into Macedon, and, the instant her boots touched Macedonian soil, everything changed. She would return not to beg, but to reign. The gates of towns opened, soldiers joined her, and even some of her former adversaries were hesitant. Even at her advanced age, Olympias' name still made people take notice. Then she got her revenge. She pursued Cassandra's adherents one by one, and when she apprehended Philip III, the mentally ill half-brother and puppet king of Deus Alexander, she put him to death. Some sources claim that Eurydice, his wife, was taken prisoner and given the chance to commit suicide. Olympias had her strangled after she refused. Olympias, who was always theatrical, orchestrated the scenario like a goddess giving, and it was cruelty wrapped in regal etiquette. Her message was plain: justice. Everyone else was a phony. Only Alexander's lineage had the authority to reign. Olympias held the kingdom in her hands for a minute, a moment of intense passion. The dynasty had been reinstated by her. She had exacted revenge on betrayers. She had shown Macedon what it looked like for a woman with nothing left to lose to wield royal authority. He returned with a rage, but Cassandra was still out there, calculating and waiting. Power in Macedon was like fire in parched grass. Her allies started to turn away from her. Polyperchon lost authority as his army outweighed hers. His resources were more extensive, and his harshness was more ruthless. The tide shifted. Olympias watched as her assailants drew closer while she was now alone in the Pydna castle. The smoke was heavy and her foes were at the gates after she had lit the match that Macedon had burned. Once the most dreaded woman in antiquity, Olympias now found herself isolated and under siege in the coastal castle of Pydna, encircled by Cassander's army, which had come to complete the task his father had begun. Olympias, however, did not plead. She didn't beg. She bore the siege like a statue sculpted from divine anger for almost a year. Food became scarce, illness spread, and allies disappeared. But inside the walls of the citadel she remained as unflappable as the kings she had previously shook. She carried herself to the end not as a prisoner, but as the ever-wary mother of a god named Cassander. Hesitated. Even now, Olympias wore a myth-like armour, and he knew that murdering her was risky. Since she was still the mother of Alexander the Great, he offered her refuge by saying that her life would be spared if she surrendered, since it could look blasphemous to strike her down. Olympias was wiser. Too many royal promises had turned to ash in her experience. However, hunger was now death rather than only misery. Her garrison snapped. Her supporters gave up, and Olympias, who remained steadfast until the end, was ultimately turned up to her adversaries. She wasn't killed by Cassandra. That would be too easy and too forgiving. Rather, he gave her to the relatives of the people she had put to death when she briefly regained control. Let them make the final decision for her. She was given a death sentence. Here's the catch, though. Nobody had the courage to deliver the first stroke when the executioners arrived. Like an oracle gazing through smoke, Olympia stood erect and gazed at them with regal, motionless eyes. They were Macedonians. They had heard about her snakes, visions, and ceremonies since they were young. In the past, they had praised her son as a living deity, but now she was a weak elderly woman shrouded in legend, and not a single man had the guts to brandish the sword. Therefore, Cassandra sent strangers, foreigners, and those who had no recollection of her authority, just commands to obey. As a result, Olympias was ultimately defeated in silence rather than with fanfare or honour. With her passing, Alexander's lineage lost all real influence, and the last remnant of an empire built on divine ambition was extinguished. Even yet, Olympias left a lasting legacy, and history would never forget the Snake Queen who died in the dust, defenceless, deserted, and put to death by the very people she had once controlled. History, however, is peculiar. Those who die in silk sheets are not usually the ones who benefit from it. It occasionally hisses in remembrance of those who died. Furthermore, Olympias was never intended for a tranquil past. Throughout her life, she had used prophecy as a shield and motherhood as a sword. She wasn't merely the mother of Alexander the Great, she was one of the people that planned his ascent. The story of the divine child, rites, the whispering of thunderbolts and lions, and the brutal extermination of rivals that made way for a youthful king to rule the known world would all be absent without her. Olympias created more than just an empire. She used her claws to guard it. Olympias, however, distinguishes out even among the most brutal dynasties of antiquity. She didn't ride into battle like Boudicca or lead armies in the field like Cleopatra. Her battleground was more subdued and icy. It was a world of oracles, priestesses, political weddings, goblets, and poison. She was aware of the power of fear, but she was much more aware of the power of believing. She may have even been convinced that her son was heavenly herself. Her adversaries were correct when they called her a manipulator, a witch, and a murderer. Olympias embodied all of those qualities and more. She grew up in a harsh society that valued cunning over kindness, and she was taught early on that mercy was a luxury that queens could not afford. She was mythologized and demonized in the centuries that followed. She was referred to as a visionary by some and a villain by others, but no historian, ancient or modern, could dismiss her as unimportant. Her ghost haunted Alexander's legacy like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain, and perhaps that's exactly where she belonged, not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's story, but as a story unto herself. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy slept next to snakes, and outlived gods Olympias, whose bones have long since turned to dust. But her legend lives on in every story about vicious queens, in every whisper of blood-borne fate, and in every myth-based empire. She is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting on the sun-bleached island of Crete, which is only a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion. Stone hallways wind in every direction. Rooms double back and twist. No stairs lead to anything. Knossos, the centre of Minoan culture, and the alleged source of one of the most lasting stories in human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur, is a place where it's easy to lose your sense of direction, even today. A unique palace that was constructed in 1900 BCE, and grew over the years existed before there was a mythology. Knossos was more than simply a royal home. It was a city spanning almost 150,000 square feet. It had more than 1,000 chambers, light wells, magazines, storage, shrines, workshops, and possibly the world's first flushing toilets. It had multi-storey residences, running water, and a sophisticated air circulation system. This was no rudimentary stronghold. It was a masterwork of architecture. For ancient visitors, Knossos likely felt magical, but to modern archaeologists, it appears to be well-organised chaos. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated Knossos in the early 1900s and soon came to believe that it was the source of the Greek labyrinth myth, is credited for bringing the site into the contemporary day. The arrangement was confusing. The architecture has deep symbolic meaning, and he saw bull images etched onto stone, painted on walls, or fashioned into small golden charms everywhere he looked. After all, the Minoans revered the bull. Evans even went so far as to give the civilization the name of Minos, the legendary king. Regardless of Minos's veracity, his tale became inextricably linked to the ruins. The twist is that no one has discovered a real labyrinth, an underground maze, jail cells, or a half-man monster. Instead, we have a far more enigmatic city that is purposefully hard to navigate, with levels, wings, and loops that make it harder to distinguish between myth and history the further you go. Thus, the question still stands. Did the palace itself give birth to the Minotaur, or did these walls? The beast? Knossos is adept at getting us to ask the correct questions about the tale, even though it may not readily provide its solutions. Is as well known as the ruin of a huge half-bull, half-man creature that was imprisoned in a labyrinth so intricate that no one who entered ever found their way out. Only the Athenian hero Theseus was able to kill the beast and make his getaway with the help of a ball of thread and Princess Ariadne's guile. However, where did this tale originate? Why a labyrinth too? The great king of Crete, King Minos, is described in the oldest versions of the tale as demanding tribute from Athens in the form of 7 boys and 7 girls annually. The Minotaur, a creature created out of shame and divine wrath, was fed these poor souls. The Minotaur, imprisoned in an underground labyrinth, represented the sinister underbelly of authority, something barbaric concealed under majesty. Crete had long been associated with luxury, mystery, and terror for the ancient Greeks. The Minoans, who lived at sea, were viewed as both sophisticated and foreign. They used bull leaping in their rites. For a visiting Greek around 1000 BCE, Knossos would have seemed like another world because of their weird gods in their artwork and their palaces, which were unlike anything on the mainland. The bull itself was considered sacred in Minoan society. Stylized bull horns may be seen on altars and rooftops, and murals depict young men and women leaping over charging bulls in ceremonial displays. The elements of a legend start to come together when you combine this with a palace that has the feel of a labyrinth. However, what if the Minotaur was more than a mere monster? Could it have been a metaphor? According to some academics, the story recalls the Cretan hegemony over the Aegean, when Athens actually honoured a more powerful foreign force. The labyrinth might represent the Minotaur, the untamed, terrible force that underpinned Minoan dominance, as well as the political captivity of smaller kingdoms. Others contend that it is more psychological, with the labyrinth representing the unconscious mind, the Minotaur representing our unconscious desires, and Theseus, the hero, bravely venturing into the dark while being led just by recollection. Even so, the myth is still intertwined with Knossos. The palace is the closest thing we have ever discovered to a true labyrinth. It is not a monster or Ariadne, but rather something more profound, perhaps a history that was begging to become myth long before Sparta sharpened its spears or Athens raised its marble temples. The Minoan civilization was one of the first highly developed societies in Europe. They governed by trade, art, and what seems to be an almost miraculous command of construction rather than conquest. Knossos, a palace that served as more than just a residence for aristocrats, was the centre of their power. It served as a centre for economy, culture, and ritual. Based on Crete, the Minoans prospered from around 2600 to 1400 BCE. They established a vast trading network that extended to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the far-off coasts of Spain. Their vessels, which carried luxury commodities, saffron, bronze, and ceramics, sliced through the Mediterranean like silent darts. They did not construct large armies. More than having guns, they became wealthy because of the ties they cultivated. The most notable aspect of Minoan culture is the contrast with that of its later Greek counterparts. Instead than focusing on conflict or divine retribution, their artwork praised nature, animals, and the fluidity of human movement. Frescoes depict dancers, dolphins, and athletes leaping over bulls. Their goddesses are also distinct, strong, bare-breasted figures who frequently carry snakes, which are representations of protection, fertility, or metamorphosis. Knossos, a complex in a lush valley rather than a castle on a hill, was at the centre of it all. Its lack of substantial defensive walls indicates that the Minoans either felt safe on their island or that they were powerful enough to not need defence. Despite their sophistication, the Minoans left no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, is still unreadable today. Their multi-storey buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and sophisticated plumbing systems all suggested a society far ahead of its time. What they termed themselves is unknown to us. We have no idea what their rulers thought, what prayers they said, or what actually took place beyond Knossos walls. The Minoans were not only palace builders. Their art, ruins, and influence were eventually assimilated by the Mycenaeans and reflected in Greek mythology. They were Mrs. Designers, Thrian Knossos was more than just a structure. It was the lifeblood of a civilization that briefly glowed on the Aegean like sunlight before fading away. However, some claim that their echo is still lost in the maze. Strolling through Knossos is like travelling across time, layered, perplexing, and exquisite. The design is what overwhelms you, not just the size. Rooms lead to other rooms. Light wells cut through the centre of the building, while corridors split and disappear. Stairs either abruptly erupt into sunny courtyards or swirl into shadows. In a straight line, nothing moves. Labyrinth Knossos was a living creature that covered an estimated 150,000 square feet, so it's easy to understand why ancient visitors could have murmured that it was more than simply a palace. There were more than 1,000 chambers in the complex, some large and some little. These rooms weren't arranged at random. Situated around a sizable central courtyard, which may have served as the site of public events or bull-leaping rituals, they were purpose-built workshops, storage areas, shrines, residences and throne rooms. Using artificial terraces and natural slopes, the palace was constructed on several levels, reaching up to 4 or 5 floors in certain areas. To find your way around it without getting lost, you'd need a thread like Theseus or memory instinct. However, beneath all of this seeming disorder lies a tremendous intelligence. The Minoans were adept at using open stairwells and air shafts for passive ventilation, which allowed them to cool interiors. Their toilets flushed long before Rome made it a fad, and they used clay pipes to channel rainwater. The so-called throne room, so named because of the alabaster chair set into the wall and the benches on either side of it, is one of the most recognisable spaces. Around it are murals of griffins, mythological protectors. Was this a sacred court, the chamber of a goddess, or the throne of a priest-king? Nobody is positive, and the walls are colourful, with murals depicting dolphins swimming over bathtubs, women wearing flounced skirts that expose their chests, and young people jumping bulls in midair. The art was more than just ornamentation. It was identity, flowing, organic, and intricately tied to the land and the ocean. Nevertheless, Knossos starts to become more confused the further you go. There are certain sections that appear purposefully complicated, as if they were meant to be confusing. The labyrinth legend may have its origins in this palace that felt alive rather than a prison for monsters. It was a structure that evoked awe, ritual, and a hint of fear. It had no locked doors or mythical beasts, but rather was designed to make you wonder where you were and what might be around the next corner. Knossos was a site of worship and an architectural manifestation of the Minoan soul, steeped in ritual myth and heavenly mystery. Not merely a royal house or administrative hub. There are no marble shrines to Athena or tall columns to Zeus, in contrast to later Greek temples. Rather, Knossos' spiritual realm is more subtly incorporated into the structure itself. Shrines can be found hiding in corners. Like holy sentinels, pillars rise. Everywhere you turn, you see stylized symbolic horns on altars and rooftops. The bull motif is prominent, implying a strong bond between respected animals and the natural world. The bull didn't appear to frighten the Minoans. They rejoiced. There is more to the well-known bull leaping fresco in Knossos than merely sports art. It might show young people from the religious rite jumping over a charging bull while dancing gracefully and dangerously. It was religious drama rather than sport, perhaps a sacrifice to the gods, or a metaphorical victory over chaos. Then there are the serpent goddesses that were found in the palace's subterranean storerooms. One of the most recognisable Minoan artefacts are the snake goddess statues, which feature bare breasts and arms outstretched with snakes coiling in their hands or around their bodies. These characters exude strength. They are not idols of submission. They are protectors of the fertility of the home and possibly of life itself. Snakes were both earthly and underworld creatures that represented mystery, rebirth, and renewal to the Minoans. Together with the horns and frescoes, the rooms in which these items were discovered suggest ceremonial areas or domestic shrines, peaceful places of worship tucked away in the busy centre of the palace. The complex as a whole, with its altars and winding hallways, starts to seem like a ritual machine. A building designed not only for survival, but also for spiritual communication. Because the palace was originally a temple, Knossos does not have a single temple. Its layout, artwork and design all reflected a spiritual vision in which there were no distinctions between the sacred and the secular. Every echo in the stone rooms might have previously been a muttered prayer, a corridor could become a path to the gods, and myth was architecture here. In addition to housing humans, Knossos was home to gods for ages, serving as a symbol of wealth, creativity, and cultural refinement. But after that, something unexpected happened that no one can really explain. What happened when the Minoan culture that once controlled the oceans disappeared like mist over the Aegean? The palace was deserted, and the frescoes were allowed to deteriorate around 1400 BCE. There are several theories. Nature is mentioned by some. One of the biggest explosions in human history occurred in 1600 BCE, on the volcanic island of Thera, which is now part of Santorini. The explosion was so powerful that it probably generated tsunamis that pounded the northern shore of Crete, destroying farms and harbours. Knossos wasn't destroyed right away, but ash clouds might have obscured the light, strangling crops and changing the climate. It's possible that the Thera eruption's aftermath rocked the foundations on an economic, political and spiritual level. Others turned to war by 1450 BCE, when the Mycenaeans' growing dominance allowed mainland Greeks to exploit Minoan vulnerability. Knossos may have been briefly reoccupied, according to archaeological data, but the culture had evolved. The art grew more martial, and Linear B, which was used by Mycenaean scribes, supplanted Linear A, the Minoan script. The palace, which had previously flourished with bull dancers and snake goddesses, was now muttered in a strange language. Some academics think that rather than capturing the island all at once, the Mycenaeans progressively assimilated it through trade, influence, and eventually rule. Others contend that the failure of the elite, political instability, civil unrest, or internal collapse might have had an equal contribution. What is remarkable, however, is the lack of violence shown in the wreckage. No traces of mass killing, no burnt skeletons. Knossos did not shout when he fell. With a whisper, it descended. Simply put, the great palatial system came to an end. The rooms fell silent. The ceremonies came to an end, and nature gradually returned. Knossos was already an ancient myth, a memory entwined with tales of monarchs, monsters, and labyrinths, when Homer sung of Crete in his epics. Perhaps that is appropriate given that Knossos was destroyed by more than simply an invasion or eruption. All great things, no matter how lovely, eventually fade under the weight of new empires. It was time. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil as just another mound of stone, lost to time, its name forgotten, its myths distorted, its walls swallowed by dust and olive groves. But the bones are still there, and if you listen carefully, the maze still hums beneath the earth. That is, until one man chose to follow a legend. Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist with a penchant for theatre and a passion for Homeric myth, bought the land that encased the ancient ruins in 1900. Evans did more than simply rediscover Knossos. He reinvented it. Strange seals and relics had been discovered by local farmers, indicating that something massive was hiding beneath their feet. What Evans discovered will forever alter the Aegean's history. He discovered a palace so large, intricate and sophisticated that he was certain it was the legendary residence of King Minos. The site's frescoes, horns and overall architectural oddity all suggested to him that the labyrinth was the location. Evans was more than a simple archaeologist. He told stories, some of which were contentious. He gave the Minoans, who constructed Knossos, the name Minos. He repaired portions of the palace with reinforced concrete, reproduced frescoes, and deciphered symbols. This action has been praised and criticised. At Knossos, what you see today is a combination of Edwardian creativity and old ruin. Some call it visionary, while others label it vandalism. Nevertheless, Evans took a risk that no one else had. Knossos was revived by him. He allowed Europe to see a world from the Bronze Age, which was much older than classical Greece and was characterised by art, mystery, and graceful sea living. In addition, he discovered the undiscovered linear script, which raises new issues regarding language, literacy, and the boundaries of our historical knowledge. Evans did more than just dig up stones, though. He brought a myth back to life and made historians face the reality that, beneath the myth of the labyrinth, there was something real, something intricate, something very human, a palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that vanished into obscurity, and a man who peeled back the earth to find a tale that was more beautiful and strange than he had ever dreamed. Knossos slept for 3 millennia. It was awakened by Evans ringing the bell. You are experiencing more than simply architecture when you go around Knossos. There is a language of symbols, carvings, frescoes, and patterns all around you. However, the Minoans left us no Rosetta Stone, and their major script, linear, is still unintelligible. We must thus perceive their thoughts disguised in patterns, carved into walls and painted over plaster, rather than interpreting them. What did they intend to communicate specifically? There is nothing like the art of Knossos in the ancient world. There are no rows of rulers, no battle-hardened heroes, and no fixation with war. Rather, we see sacred bulls, lilies in blossom, dolphins jumping, and birds in flight. Humans are graceful, light, and frequently dance or conduct rituals. Even in potentially dangerous situations, there is beauty and rhythm. The Minoans celebrated life cycles and perhaps cosmic order rather than documenting conquests. However, the double axe, also known as the LA bris, which can be seen in temples, on frescoes, and even carved into stones, is the most recognizable sign in Knossos. It is thought that the double axe is a religious symbol that may be connected to celestial cycles or female deity. According to some, the word Labris may have come from Labris itself, meaning that the labyrinth is a dwelling of the double axe rather than a trap or a maze. Then there are the horns of consecration, which are bull horns that have been stylized and positioned on altars and walls. Together with frequent representations of bulls and bull-leaping customs, these might have served as religious marks dividing sacred space from the everyday. Whether the animal stood for nature, fertility, chaos, or the divine presence, it is evident that it had profound spiritual meaning. Although there is disagreement, the bull is present everywhere, and even Knossos' design may have symbolic significance. Some archaeologists think it was constructed not just for practical purposes, but also to reflect seasonal or cosmic patterns. Its nested rooms and twisting hallways may symbolize a spiritual maze that is not a physical prison, but rather a journey through life, death, and the underworld. There is a fine line between imagination and insight in any theory. Since the Minoans use symbols rather than narratives, we must deduce what Knossos is saying. Like a thread unravelling into myth, the meaning is just out of reach, even if we can hear the rhythms and see the pictures. Yes, Knossos is a ruin, but it feels alive. If you stroll through its halls now, you'll feel a hum just beneath the surface. Not ghosts or gods, but the echoes of myths, lives, and questions that have persisted for thousands of years after its demise. We are still trapped in Knossos' labyrinth. Its shadow inspires writers to create fresh stories, archaeologists to delve for answers, and tourists to stroll through its halls. The atmosphere of the labyrinth is genuine, even though the Minotaur is a fable. Who ruled Knossos is unknown to us. The names of its priests, kings, and queens are unknown to us. The laws they lived by, and the prayers they muttered are unknown to us. However, we know they cherished beauty. They worshipped nature, as we know. They were the first before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples, before the Persian palaces, and we know they understood the importance of striking a balance between art and building, between ritual and reality. Perhaps that is what the labyrinth truly is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a story engraved in stone, a myth in architectural form. This is why there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple, and a temple that might have also been a story. The myth of the Minotaur wasn't created overnight. It originated here, from the bewilderment of its hallways, the wonder it evoked in generations who attempted to understand it, and the veneration of its bull ceremonies. It became a story to the Greeks. We made archaeology out of it. Knossos, however, has always been both at its core. We can now take pictures, make maps, visit the ruins in the sunshine, and even recreate the frescoes. However, the riddle remains. The distinction between mythology and reality continues to glimmer like heat on stone. Because Knossos doesn't provide us with all the answers, perhaps that is why it endures. It serves as a reminder that history isn't always designed to be fixed. You're supposed to feel it. And like Theseus, we're all still chasing the thread. And Knossos' ancient, tangled, partially remembered, is more than simply a location on a map. It's a mystery that gets deeper with each step. The engineers of antiquity were highly skilled. Like crazed lumberjacks, the first rams were handheld teams of troops who simply lifted a tree stump and smashed it into opposing defences. However, the battering ram changed over time. The ram was transformed from a tool into a weapon of fear when engineers mounted it inside a wheeled chassis. frequently with a roof to shield the crew from boiling oil and arrows. Rams were transformed into psychological weapons by the Assyrians, who were experts at siege warfare. Their siege towers combined archer platforms with rams, so defenders were constantly being fired upon while a city's gates were being smashed. Like slow-moving gods of disaster, relief carvings from Nineveh depict rams with pointy iron tips rolling up to the gates of rebellious cities. They were destroying more than just the front door. Rams were frequently utilised to penetrate wall weaknesses, destroy watchtowers, or completely topple gatehouses. One thing was clear from their presence: give up, or watch your fortifications fall apart like stale bread. They were refined by the Greeks. They were refined by the Romans. Large rams known as ares, which is Latin for ram, were constructed by Roman engineers and hung from chains or ropes inside vast siege bunkers. It was believed that the rhythm of their swinging beams sounded like thunder rolling on stone, and some were so large that they required dozens of workers to operate. Despite their strength, battering rams required a great deal of collaboration. In addition to protecting the ram from burning missiles, stones, and other noxious materials thrown from above, operators had to keep the ram swinging in unison. A ram that was stopped was dead. However, when a battering ram started, it really started. It couldn't be stopped. Human masonry versus wooden muscle. It was just the beginning of engineers' use of weaponized ancient physics to make walls cry. The catapult was the tactician if the battering ram was the beast. While rams shattered near, catapults struck from a distance, launching not only stones but also fear. They revolutionized siege warfare by weaponizing physics in ways that the adversary found almost miraculous, and they were the first actual pieces of artillery in military history. Around the 4th century BCE, the first catapults were invented in Greece by bright minds who wished to give combat more range and momentum. The first torsion-powered catapults, which used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs, were commissioned by Dionysius, the king of Syracuse, a tyrant with a penchant for extreme violence. These weren't huge slingshots. They were exact tools of terror during the siege. Their mechanics were the genius. By tightly twisting ropes, which were frequently composed of animal sinew, engineers discovered that they could store a vast amount of potential energy that, when released, could launch javelins, stones, or even blazing projectiles hundreds of meters. The two primary types, the stone-throwing catapult, which threw boulders over walls or straight at fortifications, and the ballista, which fired enormous bolts like a large crossbow, evolved swiftly. Then came the Roman engineers, who were always able to improve on Greek ideas. They created portable siege engines for professional armies and catapults that could be disassembled, loaded onto carts, and reassembled on location. Certain Roman catapults were able to shoot 60-pound stones at amazing speeds, blasting through battlements, wooden gates, and sometimes unlucky soldiers. Catapults were used for purposes other than devastation. Their focus was on show. They were utilised, sometimes literally, to convey messages by ancient generals. To spread dread and sickness, corpses were thrown over walls. To break morale, severed heads were thrown into beleaguered cities. In one horrifying instance, an early kind of biological warfare involved firing infected bodies into enemy territory. But there were problems with catapults. They needed experienced personnel, were heavy, and might be rendered ineffective by unfavourable terrain. However, when correctly positioned, they could safely pound a city into submission, and towns learned for the first time in history that their strong stone walls needed to be able to withstand more than simply a ram. Devastation was now flying, and they had to survive the skies. The trebuchet was imposing, tall, creaky, and menacing, assuming the catapult was smart. When one first arrived on the battlefield, it was the undeniable monarch of medieval siege warfare. It was more than just a weapon. It was a declaration. It claimed that, in contrast to their tension-powered brethren, the trebuchet, which depended on gravity, your barriers are meaningless. The basic idea behind it was straightforward. A long swinging arm with a sling on one end and a heavy counterweight on the other, set on a robust frame. Lift the weight, let it fall, and the arm would whip around, launching the deadly payload and the sling in a high arc over enemy defences. Devastating, accurate, and predictable, it was controlled destruction. The Chinese employed early attraction models as early as the 4th century BCE, when manpower took the role of counterweights, and this is where the trebuchet got its start. In the 12th century, however, the counterweight trebuchet, the one that would revolutionize siege warfare in both the Islamic and European worlds, emerged, maybe through Byzantine or Muslim influence: middlemen. As soon as the design reached Europe, it quickly spread throughout castles and crusades. It was incredible power. The true magic was in the arc, but a well-constructed trebuchet could shoot 300-pound projectiles over 300 metres. Stones the size of furniture would smash into towers, crush walls, or crush enemy morale. Trebuchets, as opposed to catapults, were able to skillfully launch missiles over walls. They weren't only destroying defences, according to this. They were striking interior supply depots, barracks, and courtyards with more than simply stones. Everything was thrown by trebuchets, including sick animals smoking pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, and even insults or messages wrapped in rocks. Warwolf, a trebuchet so large that the enemy gave up before it was even fired, is the subject of a legendary story from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland. In order to test the mechanism, the king declined to accept the surrender. However, despite its destructive power, the trebuchet was not swift. It required expert engineers and took hours to create and minutes to reload. There is still no other siege weapon that combines psychological dread, ferocity, and range quite like it. When the counterweight fell, communities held their breath while distant catapults and battering rams battered the gates. It was the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer from the skies. By rolling directly up to the enemy's front door and dropping off armed invaders, siege towers adopted a more intimate strategy. Imagine a wheeled wooden skyscraper armed with archers and spearmen and covered in damp skins to keep flames at bay. The siege tower was the ancient counterpart of a mobile castle and armoured personnel carrier. You knew the real battle was about to commence when one of them began to thunder at the walls of your city. Siege towers were not inconspicuous. When utilised properly, they were large, audacious, and terrifyingly effective. The Greeks, and particularly the Hellenistic kingdoms, took the design to dramatic heights during the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE. The Macedonian general Demetrius constructed a 9-storey tower known as the Helepolis, or Taker of Cities. The Assyrians may have been among the first to use them in the 9th century BCE. Standing more than 100 feet tall, it was manned by thousands of troops and had iron plate-covered catapults. The theory behind siege towers was straightforward, but the ambition was so great that it also collapsed under its own weight. Walls are only effective if you are unable to overcome them. By providing an elevated platform from which attackers could descend onto the battlements, siege towers nullified that advantage. By avoiding gates and climbing ladders from the top deck, archers could shower death down on defenders as warriors on the lower levels readied themselves to board. However, these towers were not unbeatable. Due to their slowness, susceptibility to mud, and perfect location for defenders using fire arrows to roll rocks or even ruin terrain, they were easy targets. To halt a tower's approach, astute defenders would construct auxiliary inner walls called counterscarp fortifications, flood moats, or dig ditches. Nevertheless, they produced amazing stuff when they did it. It was one thing to have a hole in the wall, but it was quite another to have your own ramparts suddenly overrun by enemy troops. Siege towers made the battleground a vertical struggle for survival, rather than a horizontal conflict of power. Once the gangplank fell from a siege tower to the city walls, they turned height into both a strength and a weakness. There was no going back. As trebuchet swords and rams crashed and some of the most destructive siege tactics took place in silence underneath, it was time for hand-to-hand hell. The evil skill of destroying a city by destroying the earth it stood on was known as siege tunnelling or sapping. The concept was literally ancient and horribly successful. After excavating beneath the enemy's wall and supporting it with wooden pillars, light the pillars on fire. When the timbers burnt away, the tunnel collapsed, destroying the wall's foundation. Your city stood firm 1 minute, and then a huge chunk of the outside wall fell away like stale bread. This approach didn't seem very impressive. Tunnelling was the slow, unseen death of the Assyrians' early fortress warfare, yet there were no loud engines or deafening launches. There have been variations, but the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies brought the method to its zenith. The Spartans tried digging behind the walls during the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, but the defenders dug counter-tunnels and stopped the mid-dig, transforming the soil into a nightmare for knife fights. Countermining is the term for this defensive strategy, which gave siege warfare a spooky feel. Imagine soldiers searching for the sound of enemy picks while excavating hundreds of feet below the surface in complete darkness. As soon as they heard tapping, they would rush to stop it, which frequently led to cramped, violent confrontations fought by torchlight using shovels and knives. It was filled with horror, suffocation, and grime instead of glory. However, when undermining succeeded, the outcomes were disastrous. In 1212, one of the most notorious instances occurred. King John's troops dug a tunnel behind the southern wall of Rochester Castle in England, filled it with pig fat, and lit it on fire during the siege. The entire tower above the defenders was brought down by the collapse of the supports, leaving them astonished and quickly surrendering. Siege engineers were experts at spotting shaky foundations, assessing the behaviour of the soil, and precisely planning collapses by the 13th century. They combined their skills as geologists and demolitionists, and although tunnelling took time, effort, and a little bit of insanity, it demonstrated a fundamental aspect of siege warfare. If you couldn't get through or over a wall, you could always take it down from below. The attackers did not cause all of the drama in siege warfare. Defenders had their own lethal strategies for each ram constructed or tower rolled forward, and occasionally those strategies were hot. The most horrific of them all is Greek fire, which was created by the Byzantines in the 7th century CE. It was a mystery substance that resembled napalm and could adhere to walls, ships, and human flesh. It continued to burn even when water was thrown into clay pots or sprayed from siphons. It produced scenes of utter mayhem. Nobody is certain how it was made to this day. The formula perished with the Empire because it was so secret. However, its consequences were legendary. In just a few minutes, entire fleets were turned to burning skeletons, and that was only the beginning. In lower-tech fortifications, boiling liquids were the preferred weapon. Murder holes, those charming holes in the ceilings of towers or entrances, would pour boiling water, oil or sand straight onto intruders below. Particularly dreaded was oil. In contrast to water, it adhered to skin, seeping into armour and clothing before being ignited. Though less dramatic, hot sand was fierce in its own right. It would slip into armour gaps, particularly around the neck or wrists, causing second and third degree burns as it cooked the flesh underneath. While it didn't appear impressive from a distance, it quickly transformed brave warriors into screaming wrecks. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be met with fire that you could never put out. The old-fashioned laws of physics were also invoked by the defenders. Gravity was turned into a weapon. Parapets were used to drop massive stones, logs, or even dead animals upon densely populated military formations or siege engines. The objective was to simultaneously destroy the machines and morale, not only kill. Then there were spiked barricades, collapsed bridges, concealed pits, and traps. Castles evolved into painful puzzles intended to punish, slow, and perplex. All of this had the same goal. Each minute a wall was held, the enemy's supply lines were getting thinner, sickness was spreading in the camps, or reinforcements were coming. Raw destruction was only half the purpose of siege warfare, which was a game of attrition in which the defenders had ingenuity and a great deal of simmering wrath, while the attackers had the advantage of physics. The other half was psychological dominance. Siege weapons were more than simply military equipment. They broke the defender's will before the walls were even taken down. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower and every arcing rock thrown by a trebuchet were created to sow one seed in the thoughts of those behind the walls. They were huge, creaking, burning symbols of doom. You're not secure. Ancient leaders were aware of this. With a great deal of fuss, the Assyrians paraded their siege engines in the open. The siege was constructed by the Romans. Camps directly in front of the enemy allowed defenders to observe the assembly of battering rams and the testing of catapults. Fear was part of the script, and siege was theatre. Occasionally a message was carried by the payloads themselves. Generals or messengers, frequently still in their armour, would have their severed heads hurled over the walls. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon, it was an announcement. During the Mongol siege of Kafir in 1346, it's thought that throwing corpses infected with plague over the walls contributed to outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. During the siege of Constantinople, defenders were not only bombarded with rocks but also with bodies, diseased corpses launched to spread panic and plague. Everyone in the fortress could hear the creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thunk of the counterweight like the heartbeat of an impending storm, and the most scary part, the unknown, before they could see one of these monsters being rolled into position. You had no idea what would happen next. The pounding of a battering ram or the unexpected hush before a shot would make defenders crazed with suspense. Other sounds that could be used as psychological weapons include a rock, a barrel of fire, a rain of arrows, or just a heavy, menacing silence while engineers adjusted their aim. Because in siege warfare, the mind can sometimes collapse before the masonry as gunpowder thunders onto the battlefield, commanders wanted to instill a sense of hopelessness in the enemy, convince them that resistance was futile, that their gods had abandoned them, and that their walls were merely temporary barriers in the path of fate. When that mental dam finally cracked, the gates frequently opened without a fight. Traditional siege engines gradually came to a stop in the late medieval period, but their legacy persisted. It changed. The development of guns altered everything, since a trebuchet required hours to accomplish what a single, carefully aimed shot from a cannon could do in seconds. Once thought to be impenetrable, stone barriers turned to become liabilities. By the 15th century, iron balls falling through the parapets of Europe's great castles were causing them to collapse, not fire or undermining. The concepts established by ancient siege engineers remained relevant even as siege warfare evolved into its next phase, which was explosive, cruel, and noisy. The catapult and trebuchet continue to be a source of inspiration for modern artillery. The same question underlies all ballistic missiles and long-range howitzers. How can something that is supposed to be indestructible be broken from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force were all developed, tested, and refined decades before gunpowder ever made an appearance. Ancient siege tactics are the origin of modern military psychology, shock and awe, overwhelming weaponry, and evident supremacy. The first shock and awe was those imposing siege engines rumbling forward with flags flapping in the breeze. They were about shattering the soul of a city, not just smashing through a wall. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still adorn the desert, you can still see their legacy carved into the remains of old cities. At castles throughout Europe, where rounded towers and angled bastions tell the tale of a world continuously reinventing itself to withstand the next siege, layers of walls stood for a millennium against every machine imaginable before being finally taken down by cannon fire. And siege warfare still exists today, despite the advent of drones and satellite-guided missiles. It simply vanished. We are still surrounded by digital cities. Defenders remain isolated. The essence of the siege is still the same, even whether walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. Both parties are prepared to wait, build, and break in order to gain entry and prevent them from entering. There are no more battering hammers. The trebuchets belong to a museum. However, the essence of siege warfare remains as potent and deadly as ever.